She was the first real supermodel, and the last person who ever wanted to be one, the most photographed woman of the 1,960 seconds spent the rest of her life quietly running away from those photographs. Jean Shrimpton did not just walk away from the fashion world. She walked away from the idea that her face belonged to everyone else. She once said, "I never cared about fashion. That's just who I am. I like it on other people, but I don't fuss over it. I barely remember it." And yet it was her face. The two big eyes, the long limbs, the slightly awkward stillness that helped define a decade obsessed with youth and ease. Jean Shrimpton seemed to have everything the 1,960 seconds promised. Beauty and a revolution at her feet. Then, a single moment changed everything. One dress, one photograph, and an entire country lost its mind. What she wore, in theory, should not have mattered. But in 1965 it became a national scandal, and behind those iconic images was someone else entirely. A shy farm girl who felt like a prop in other people's lives, a woman the world called the most beautiful of her generation while she herself spoke about having an exploitable neurosis. At the exact crest of her career, when she was the most photographed woman alive, she made a choice that stunned the industry. She simply walked away. Her story does not begin in a studio or a glossy office on Condé Nast's floors. It begins on a farm in Buckinghamshire, in a world of animals, mud, and quiet routines that repeated themselves with the seasons. She was born in 1942 into a family that valued reliability more than dreams. Mornings meant chores, not fantasies. The horizon was hedgerows and fields, not skyline and flashbulbs. Winters were damp and bone-cold. Summers were a mix of boredom and sudden, intense labor when the harvest came in. The rhythm of the year was written in small tasks: feeding animals before school, helping with washing, laying the table at the same time every evening. The idea that life could be any other way simply did not arise. She later called herself a reserved girl, someone who hovered at the edges of groups, wanting to please, but never quite believing she belonged. There is a particular kind of child who grows up watching other people closely, scanning for signs of disapproval, learning to read the room before they enter it. That child often becomes very good at doing what is expected, and very bad at saying no. Jean carried that training like a second skin. At home, she learned early that keeping the peace mattered. Her father worried about money. Her mother worried about what the neighbors would think. Jean watched the way her mother smoothed conversations over, laughed off small hurts, put a brave face on disappointments. Nobody in the house talked about feelings as such. They talked about chores, about weather, about yields. If she cried, she was told not to make a fuss. If she did, well, she was praised for being sensible. Being good meant not taking up too much space. Nothing in her surroundings suggested she was destined for anything other than a sensible job, a modest life, perhaps a small house, not so different from the one she had grown up in. At 17, she did the practical thing. She moved to London, enrolled at a secretarial college, and learned to type. London was noisy, dirty, anonymous. The traffic never seemed to stop. The air tasted of coal and petrol. The pavements were crowded with people who all seemed to know where they were going. For a girl who had grown up measuring distances by fields and hedges, the city felt like a maze that rearranged itself every day. It was also the first place where her face became a problem. On buses, men stared. In queues, women looked twice, their eyes running over her as if trying to place her. By her own description, she thought of herself as innocent-looking and cultish. But what strangers saw was a particular configuration of features that the camera loved. A delicate jawline, wide-set eyes, a softness that made every expression feel like a secret. She walked fast, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink away from her own visibility. In the evenings, she went back to a rented room that smelled of other people's cooking, wrote letters home about her typing lessons and left out the part about the stairs. One day, crossing a street, she was stopped by a man who introduced himself as a film director. He asked if she had ever thought about modeling or acting. She had not. He took her details anyway. For a girl who had measured her worth in neat typing and punctuality, the attention was intoxicating and frightening. A test meeting led nowhere. A producer shrugged. She went home feeling crushed and faintly ridiculous, as if she had been foolish to believe, even for an afternoon, that something extraordinary might happen, but the seed had been planted. If strangers saw something in her that could be used, perhaps it should at least be trained. On the director's advice, she enrolled at the Lucy Clayton Modeling School. The brochures promised deportment, elegance, poise. The reality for Jean was hours of learning to walk in a straight line without tripping over her own legs, balancing books on her head and trying not to blush. When instructors adjusted her posture, she was, one photographer later recalled, the clumsiest, most awkward thing you ever saw. But the awkwardness was part of the spell. She did not look like the polished society mannequins who had glided through the 1,950 seconds. She looked like a real girl caught in the wrong place. When she practiced in front of the school mirrors, she sometimes burst out laughing at herself, the way her long limbs seemed to arrive in a room before the rest of her. On bad days, she went home certain she would be sent away, told she simply wasn't model material. On good days, an instructor would nod, just once, and she would live on that nod for weeks. Her early jobs were unimpressive. Catalog work, small adverts, endless castings where nothing came of it. She crisscrossed London with a dog-eared AZ Street atlas in her handbag, always worried about being late, always worried about getting it wrong. She was tall, about 5'10", but she did not yet inhabit her height. On some days she thought she looked quite pretty. On the days it mattered most, she felt, as she later said, particularly awful. What she had, without quite understanding it, was a rare ability in front of the lens. When the shutter clicked, she did not pose. She simply became very, very still, as if some internal film had paused between two thoughts. Photographers recognized it before she did. That stillness made every frame feel like a moment stolen from something unscripted. It took one man to see how far that could go. In 1960, on a Vogue job, she was assigned to a slightly chaotic young photographer's assistant with a second-hand camera and an East End accent. The fashion establishment still associated with delivery boys, not artists. He introduced himself simply as Bailey. David Bailey. He was 5 years older, all sharp elbows and restless energy, contemptuous of the received good taste that governed British fashion pages. He swore, he joked, he moved constantly. She was shy, watchful, inward. The attraction was immediate and mutual. She broke off her existing attachment. He left his wife. In the small flat they shared, there were always contact sheets spread over tables, camera equipment piled in corners, music playing too loudly. Friends dropped in at all hours. Bailey loved the noise. Jean often retreated to the kitchen, washing up or making tea, listening to the chatter from the doorway. Very quickly, they were no longer just photographer and model. They were a couple, one of the first to be presented by the press as the living embodiment of swinging London. When I was first with Bailey, it was great fun, she recalled. We were very much in love, and everything was really opening up for us. It was quite a magical time. The magic, for Bailey, was also professional. He had found a face that did what he wanted without having to be told. He did not have to cajole her into expressions. He simply watched her settle into herself and pressed the shutter at the right moment. For Jean, the relationship blurred lines that had never been clear in the first place. Was she in the room because she was loved, or because she was useful. Did the pictures exist because of their intimacy? Or did the intimacy exist to feed the pictures? At 19, she did not yet have the tools to tease those questions apart. In 1962, British Vogue commissioned a feature called The Young Idea. It was meant to showcase a new kind of British fashion, less stiff, more alive. The editor agreed that Bailey should shoot it, but balked when he insisted on taking Jean, still relatively unknown, as his only model. Bailey dug in. Jean would go, or he would not shoot. The magazine relented. In New York, the two of them ignored every safe option. They could have put her in front of the Statue of Liberty, in a taxi, in a hotel lobby, as generations of fashion stories had done. Instead, Bailey dragged her into the streets. He photographed her on littered pavements, in Harlem doorways, in Chinatown alleyways. He made her lean against graffiti-scarred brick, sit on fire escapes, dart across crossings while the lights changed. She walked through traffic in a coat that flapped open in the wind, hair whipping across her face, while cabs blared past and passers-by stared. Children watched from stoops. A woman called out, half amused, asking if she was someone famous. John smiled, uncertain, and Bailey, already seeing the contact sheet in his mind, shouted for her not to move. The resulting images startled the fashion world. They were grainy, energetic, slightly chaotic. The clothes were there, but the focus was the girl. You could imagine her taking the coat off and going home, or turning away from the camera and vanishing into the crowd. Critics later called it the start of a new realism in fashion photography, a kitchen sink sensibility imported into the glossy pages. For Jean, it was simply work. Long days, tired feet, the peculiar mental effort of being looked at for hours at a time. Bailey understood faster what the pictures meant. His name was on the credits. The negatives were in his files. In the economy of images, that meant long-term power. Jean received her day rate and a modest per diem. She went back to a rented room and worried about the gas bill. "He made an awful lot of money out of me," she said much later, without bitterness, as if stating a natural law. It was the pattern of the decade. Men would own the rights. She would be the reason those rights had value. By the mid-1960s, her face was everywhere. She appeared on the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, advertising campaigns, even Time magazine. Newspapers called her the Shrimp, a nickname she loathed. Strangers greeted her in the street as if they knew her. Designers insisted on her presence at shows. In photographs, she looked aloof, almost bored, an expression that millions of girls tried to imitate in front of their own mirrors. Inside, she was often simply anxious and tired. What fashion sold in those years was not just clothes, but an attitude, youth, insouciance, a refusal to be bound by old rules. The irony was that Jean herself was anything but carefree. She worried about doing things properly, about disappointing people. The same compulsion that had made her a meticulous typist made her a reliable model. "People who want to succeed and do succeed are neurotic," she would say. "I had this neurosis that could be exploited." Agencies, photographers, lovers, clients, they all benefited from that hidden knot of fear, the feeling that if she said no, everything might collapse. In 1965, that private anxiety collided with public outrage in a way no one could have scripted. The Melbourne Cup, in Australia, was the kind of occasion where rules mattered. Hats and gloves were not suggestions but duties. The turf at Flemington was as much a catwalk for conservative respectability as it was a track for horses. DuPont, keen to promote its Orlan fabric, flew Jean out as a guest judge and figurehead. She packed quickly. A London dressmaker had been sent a limited length of the new material and cut a simple white shift from it. On the hanger it looked unremarkable. On her body it ended 4 inches above the knee. On Derby Day, she arrived at the racecourse to a wall of humidity and expectation. The air smelled of trampled grass, horses, cigarette smoke, and perfume. Announcers' voices floated over tinny loudspeakers, calling odds and race times. Women in carefully tilted hats lined the rails. Men in suits held programs like shields. John stepped from the car bareheaded, bare-armed, bare-legged. The breeze hit the exposed skin at the back of her knees. For a second she thought only that she should have brought a jacket, that the dress might actually be too simple, too plain, for such a formal day. Somewhere behind her, a DuPont representative was already starting to panic. Silence traveled ahead of her down the path. Then came the collective intake of breath, the murmurs, the first hard stares. To the older women present, the absence of hat and gloves was already an insult. The dress was something else. It was not just that it was short. It was that it looked as if it had not asked permission. A local paper thundered that the highest-paid model in the world had flouted the ironclad Flemington rules by appearing with no hat, no gloves, and no stockings. Another column described her as almost naked. Close-up shots of her knees were printed as if they were evidence in a trial. Camera crews dropped to their knees to get lower angles, making the dress look shorter than it already was. I had no idea it would cause a fuss, Jean said later. She was more embarrassed by the circus than by her bare legs. For her, it had been a practical choice. The day was hot. The fabric was limited. The dress was comfortable. For the culture watching, it became a symbol. The incident is still cited as the moment the miniskirt went international. The day youth quite literally bared its knees in front of an appalled older generation. That evening, back in her hotel room, she stared at the television as commentators replayed the footage and argued about her hemline as if it were a piece of legislation. The next morning, the newspapers were worse. Headlines that reduced her to a pair of legs. Editorials about declining standards. She felt as if she had walked into a play halfway through, the villain in a script she had never agreed to perform. DuPont executives fussed and apologized on her behalf. She wanted only to go home. The fallout was both absurd and revealing. Fashion historians, politicians, commentators, everyone had an opinion about the hemline. Few people asked how the woman inside the dress felt. The answer was disoriented, then tired. The trip extended her fame, brought more offers, more requests, more pressure. It also deepened the sensation that her life was being written elsewhere. She had become a screen onto which a restless decade projected its fantasies of freedom. Her relationships did little to counter that feeling. The men closest to her tended, in different ways, to see her first as an idea and only second as a person, a muse, a prize, a symbol of having made it. She was aware of this without quite knowing how to prevent it. Saying no had never been her strength. Sliding into roles other people had written for her felt natural, even when those roles hurt. After she and Bailey drifted apart, she began a romance with actor Terrence Stamp. Visually, they were perfect together. His extraordinary bone structure beside her wide-eyed stillness. Two faces that seemed designed for close-up. They were photographed at premieres, on the street, in cafes. But intimacy, as with Bailey, was complicated by work and ego. Stamp, ambitious in his own way, was uneasy with the idea of being overshadowed by a girlfriend whose face was already globally recognized. He refused to give her a key to their flat, a small gesture that carried a large message about who truly belonged. When she considered acting, he undercut the idea in an interview, quipping that she stood more chance of becoming a brain surgeon. He organized commercial jobs for her, endorsements, appearances, and quietly skimmed 10% of the fees, without telling her. When she discovered it, something in her snapped. The relationship ended. Years later, he claimed he had meant to surprise her with a lump sum. For Jean, it confirmed a pattern, again and again. people who claimed to love her also found ways to profit from her. In public, she still looked like the embodiment of the new, relaxed, liberated woman. In private, she felt increasingly boxed in by that image. She did not find parties exciting. She found them exhausting. She did not enjoy being fussed over by hairdressers and stylists. She tolerated it because it was part of the job. The belief that she was somehow lucky to be in this position made it harder to complain. Models were meant to be grateful. She was grateful, and also quietly miserable. By her late 20s, the glamour had begun to feel like a golden cage. The work was repetitive. Arrive, change, be pinned into something, be looked at, be adjusted. Try not to flinch when a hairdresser tugged too hard. Listen to conversations about clothes that meant little to her. Go home. Wait for the phone to ring again. The money was better than anything her parents could have imagined. But it came with no security. There were no royalties, no pension, no guarantee that the next season designers would still want her face. She woke some mornings with her heart racing, already exhausted by a day that had not yet begun. Small decisions. What to wear. To a casting. Whether to accept a job that sounded dull but well paid. Loomed larger than they should. She went to doctors who told her she was run down, prescribed vitamins, advised rest she could not quite afford to take. At parties, she sometimes found herself standing at a window, looking out at the city lights, wondering how many of the people below would recognize her if she stepped outside with no makeup on. More than once, she had the uncanny sense that her own face had become a mask someone else was wearing. Underneath the visible success, the exploitable neurosis she later spoke of was tightening. The industry's unspoken bargain was simple. As long as she kept offering up her image, the attention and the work would continue. The moment she stopped, she risked disappearing entirely. For someone raised on the fear of letting others down, of being seen as uncooperative or difficult, that was a powerful leash. And yet the idea of stopping began to haunt her. It crept in at odd moments, in a taxi between jobs, in a hotel room at night, in the quiet after a day on set, when she took off her makeup and for a second did not recognize the woman in the mirror, because she looked too much like the pictures. What would it mean to step out of all this? Was there even a way back to ordinary life once a face had been turned into a symbol? In her early 30s, she found out. There was no single dramatic incident, no collapse on the runway, no scandal that drove her out. There was simply the slow accumulation of a feeling that she had reached the end of what this life could offer her. Offers still came in. She said no more often. London, with its nervous whirl of parties and shoots, felt less like a city and more like a set she could walk off. On the southwest coast of England, there was a different landscape. Cornwall, with its harsh light, its Atlantic winds and its sense of being slightly outside of time. Down there, in Penzance, she bought an antique shop. It was work of a very different kind. Instead of lending her body to clothes, she handled objects that already had stories. Mirrors, furniture, chipped porcelain, old prints. She priced them, dusted them, talked to customers who had no idea who she was, and often no interest in fashion at all. The shift was not a romantic fantasy of escape. It was a daily practice. There were accounts to keep, suppliers to deal with, the endless small frictions of running a small business. The adjustment was not instantaneous. In the early months, she sometimes caught herself standing very straight behind the counter, arranging her hands in the unconscious poses she had learned in studios, as if a photographer might burst through the door at any moment. Gradually, that reflex faded. Days passed in which nobody commented on her appearance at all, and she discovered that anonymity had its own, unfamiliar weightlessness. No one cared if her hair was perfect. No one expected her to embody a decade. With Michael Cox, a local businessman who became her partner and later her husband, she took on something larger, the Abbey, a historic hotel near the seafront. The building was beautiful, with its view over the harbor and its slightly faded grandeur. It was also drafty, leaky, and expensive to maintain. They bought it anyway. Her wedding there was quiet. 2 witnesses, some champagne, fish and chips. No magazine covers, no Baileys or stamps, no one asking who she was wearing. For more than 40 years, that hotel shaped her days. She ordered linen, checked rooms, worried about plumbing and heating, dealt with staff, soothed complaining guests, and watched storms roll in from the Atlantic. On summer mornings, she arranged flowers in vases in the hallway, listening to the clatter of breakfast dishes from the kitchen. In winter, she stood at upstairs windows and watched the rain smear the harbor lights into long, wavering streaks. Once or twice, a former fashion insider booked a room, did a double take at the sight of her behind the desk, and then, after a hesitant conversation, left with the unnerving feeling that the 1,960 seconds had somehow folded into the present. Fame became a distant hum. Occasionally, a visitor would look twice at the woman at the desk and later, over breakfast, whisper to someone else that the manager looked like someone they had once seen in a magazine. Often they convinced themselves it could not possibly be her. She did not correct them. Motherhood, when her son Thaddeus was born, added another layer of ordinary complexity. Being up in the night with a crying child, thinking about school fees and dentists, left little room for the glossy narrative of supermodeldom. At the same time, the old melancholy did not disappear. She described herself as a melancholy soul, someone prone to a background sadness even in safety. Sometimes she looked at the photographs from the 1,960 seconds, the girl frozen mid-stride in New York, the white dress at Flemington, and felt as if she were looking at someone else. Money, the old anxiety, reappeared in a new form. Hotel roofs leak. Old buildings demand constant investment. By the late 1,980 seconds, the Abbey needed serious repairs. The sums were not catastrophic, but they were beyond what the business could easily absorb. At that point, an offer came that joined her past and present in a way she had hoped to avoid. A publisher wanted a book. Her story, they argued, was too important a slice of cultural history to be left untold. There would be a ghostwriter. There would be an advance. Enough to fix the roof, she agreed, reluctantly. I didn't want the book to exist, she said later, but practicality had its own demands. The result, published in 1990, was a polite memoir that touched on the famous episodes: Bailey, New York, Melbourne, the decision to leave. Without savaging the industry that had made her, it did what it was meant to do. Repaired the roof, answered a few questions, added another layer of myth to the image of the shy girl who had once accidentally scandalized a racecourse. It also confirmed something she already knew. Even when she tried to control the story, it still did not quite feel like hers. Age, for most models, is the enemy. For Jean, it was something else. Proof that time really could put distance between a person and the image that had once imprisoned her. As she moved into her 50s, 60s, 70s, the world of fashion went on without her. New faces took her place. The pictures remained, endlessly reproduced in coffee table books and documentaries about the 60s. She remained in Cornwall, working, then gradually working less, talking occasionally to journalists who made the pilgrimage and were surprised to find no bitterness. When asked about modern models, she was generous to them and unsparing of herself. Girls today are much more beautiful than we were, she said. The standard is much higher. The models today are extraordinary compared with us. We were just a nicer bunch of people. I think, because we were more innocent. It is a typical Shrimpton line, self-deprecating, slightly barbed, hinting at a critique without spelling it out. Beauty, in her accounting, had become more industrialized, more technically precise. Innocence had become rarer. Looking at the new campaigns, she acknowledged the athleticism, the professionalism, the scale of the business. But she also recognized something of her own younger self in the way today's faces are required to be constantly available, constantly optimized. The machinery had become more sophisticated, the basic transaction, a person's image converted into profit for other people, remained eerily the same. In 2023, in her 80s, she and Cox put the Abbey up for sale. They were tired. Running a hotel is a young person's game. The decision closed a circle. A girl who had left Buckinghamshire for London, then London for the world, had spent most of her adult life in one small corner of England, serving tea and handing over keys, while her younger self remained forever in print, mid-stride on a Manhattan street or bare-kneed at a racecourse in Australia. What, then, is the real legacy of Jean Shrimpton? The easy answer is visual. She changed the way fashion photographs looked. She helped drag them out of the salon and into the street. She made it possible for models to have personalities, moods, and visible doubts. She showed that clothes could be worn by a girl who looked as if she might, at any second, say no and walk away. Without her, it is hard to imagine Twiggy's androgynous melancholy, or Kate Moss leaning against a wall in torn denim, making a generation feel that being a little uncertain, a little fragile, could be strangely powerful. The industry learned, through women like Jean, that vulnerability could be packaged and sold just as effectively as hauteur. A whole economy of natural images, of apparently spontaneous moments, grew out of those early sessions of her standing in the street, looking as if she had merely been interrupted on her way somewhere else. But there is another legacy, harder to put on a page. It is contained in the fact that when she could have extended her fame, turned herself into a brand, attached her name to perfumes, makeup, reality shows, she chose instead to step out of circulation. In an industry that worships visibility, she treated invisibility as a luxury worth more than money. In a culture that tells women that their highest achievement is to be looked at, she quietly built a life in which being looked at was optional, occasional, and often irrelevant. For younger models and actresses hearing about her now, there is something almost shocking in that decision. Careers today are built not only on images but on constant self-exposure, social media feeds, behind-the-scenes clips, relentless self-promotion. The idea that someone could be at the center of a global visual culture and then almost entirely withdraw feels like a missing chapter in the rulebook. Jean never set herself up as a moralist. She did not tell other women what they should do. She simply refused. For herself, the bargain that said her value depended on remaining endlessly available to the gaze. The photographs are still here. The girl in the white dress at Flemington is still perpetually about to take another step. The young woman in New York is still forever mid-stride, hair blown back, face turned slightly away. They have become part of the collective memory of a decade. The woman who made them possible lives mostly off-camera, somewhere on a coastline where the wind is louder than the noise of fashion. When a face has been turned into a global commodity, what counts as a happy ending? Another campaign, another cover, another comeback, or the right to turn away and belong, at last, only to oneself.